Hello and welcome back to the Joy of Tennis Teaching. My name is Dan Aubuchon, and last week I came back for the first time in quite a while to do a YouTube video in this series. And I really want to thank those of you who viewed the video, and especially those of you that sent me messages. I heard from tennis coaches from all over the world, some I hadn't heard from in many years, so it was great to get back in touch. I apologize for not responding to everybody. Communication on typing on the phone and on a computer is still a bit of a challenge for me, but thank you and keep sending the comments. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. And thanks especially for those of you that called me, like Phil Azar and Darko Petrovic. Phil is a tennis director in Austria at PBI Hotel Stangelwirt, and Darko's in North Macedonia, and he and I worked together for 3 summers in Maine at Camp Takaho. Darko asked me if I could at some point do a video on the values and character traits that it took to be successful in tennis. So ask and you shall receive, Darko. Here's my take on the values and character traits that go into being a successful tennis player. First of all, you have to understand that the challenge in every individual sport is the challenge in between your ears. Whether it's swimming or biking or golf or tennis, if it's an individual sport, it's a lot about our self-belief and our self-doubt, and it's a lot about our character. Many years ago when I was working at Bighorn Golf Club, the great Pancho Segura, the coach and former phenomenal player, came to visit Bighorn and visit one of our members. Pancho was sitting on the side of the court watching his friend play some tennis, and when I finished my lesson, I went over and sat down next to Pancho because he's just a brilliant tennis mind. This woman came up to Pancho while I was sitting there, and she asked him, did he think tennis was a good sport for building character? And I was sure Pancho was going to say yes, because that's what I had always been led to believe, that tennis was a great sport to build character. But Pancho thought about it for a few moments, and he said, no, I don't believe tennis builds character. I believe tennis reveals character. And I thought this was just a brilliant statement, because if you've ever watched a high-level tennis match, you've seen the character of the player reveal itself as soon as the going got tough. So as I started to try to list the various character traits and values that would help make you a successful tennis player, I realized there was a lot of either or. There's a lot of ideas that people held about character traits for a tennis player that I slightly disagreed with and wanted to modify. So here are 5 pairs of ideas that I would like you to consider. First of all, selfishness versus self-interest. For a long time, I've always heard that, oh, tennis players are selfish. And then I'd hear tennis players defend themselves by saying, well, you have to be selfish in order to succeed in this sport. The second one is the idea of staying in your comfort zone versus developing a high level of grit and perseverance. The third value pair that I want to explore is the idea of your logical thinking versus an emotional response. And that's a very, very important one. The fourth one is a big picture versus the immediate feedback that you get in tennis. It's very easy to focus on the result right there and lose focus on the big picture. And the fifth one is wanting to win versus love of the game. So let's go through these a little bit. First, starting off with self-interest versus selfishness. Those of you that have watched Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal over the last 20-something years would never accuse them of being selfish. But both players have very healthy egos and a strong degree of self-interest. By self-interest, I mean taking care of yourself, putting yourself in the best position to succeed. Do you know what foods help you the most? Do you know what your rest patterns need to be? How do you prepare? You know, a lot of players get irritated by the way Rafa sprints back and forth right before they go on court, but that's his self-interest. Selfishness means putting yourself above others. It means for professional tennis players not treating the media well, or not signing autographs for the fans, or there's a whole variety of things. But I think that the top players over the last 20 years have disproved this idea that you have to be selfish to succeed. I believe you have to develop a healthy self-interest. Number 2 is your comfort zone. You have to get out of your comfort zone in order to improve. But by definition, that means you're going to be uncomfortable. How do you succeed in these uncomfortable situations? Well, you have to develop a high degree of perseverance. There was a great book that came out quite a few years ago, written by, I believe, a Stanford professor, Angela Duckworth, and the book was called Grit. And grit is a combination of perseverance and toughness and just basically guts. I remember Peter Burwash telling me in the final evaluation in tennis, it all comes down to guts. Are you tough enough to fight through the adversity? So we want you to develop a high level of grit and perseverance, and don't be afraid to get out of your comfort zone. This third one is very important to me because of a player that I've worked with for a long time. Tends to react very emotionally to the situations that happen on court. He's a very sensitive person, and he lets his emotions run his life sometimes. In order to improve as a tennis player, you have to have a high level of awareness of what's really happening. You have to be logical. You have to be rational. You have to be able to separate what's happening with your performance, with your feelings and your emotions. Emotions burn too hot. They flare up and they go down. You know, you can't depend on it. I've never been a big fan of the, let's go tennis players who try to fuel themselves with emotion, because even positive emotion can backfire on you, because what do you do when it recedes? I always have preferred the more intellectual, logical, thoughtful player who recognizes what's going on. Number 4 is big picture versus short term. This is a real challenging one, because when you enter a tennis tournament and you play a match, you win or you lose. It's a binary choice. You don't, there's no moral victories. But when you're trying to develop your game, you have to develop a long-term perspective. And maybe they aren't moral victories, but you have to recognize when you're making progress, even in the face of adversity, even in the face of losses. I was talking to a young player that had aspirations of playing on the Pro Tour, and I felt he had the physical capabilities. I felt he had the tennis skills, but what I didn't know was he going to be able to cope with the losing? Think about it. The biggest tournaments in the world, the Australian Open, the French Open, Wimbledon, the US Open, 128 draws, 128 men, 128 women. At the end of those 2 weeks, there's only one winner. Everybody else loses. 127 people lose. But you have to develop a perspective, a big picture outlook. Maybe you're a young up and coming player and it's your first time in a major event and you lose in the first round, but you competed well and you proved to yourself that you belong at this level. And the first round losers now make over $100,000. So you probably made enough money to finance the rest of your year on the tour. So develop that big picture outlook and don't let the short-term setbacks, rock you off course. And finally, my favorite one of all is the idea of want to versus love of the game. Everybody wants to win. I've never seen a tennis player that went on the court and said, I want to lose. We all want to win, but do we love the game enough that we can still take value out of our experience if we don't win? Again, I go back to Roger and Rafa, the two pillars of our game for the last 20-something years. Rafa's endured more physical pain and more injuries than any other player I've ever heard of. And yet he still would come back and he would still fight just as hard as he always did. I believe the love of the game is the single most important value, the single most important character trait if you want to get better as a tennis player. Jimmy Connors made a great statement once. He said, I never lost a match. I just ran out of time before I solved the problem of how to win it. And I really, respected that. Jimmy Connors was one of the greatest competitors of all time. Rafa's an unbelievable competitor. Roger, loved the game, and he loved the game from the time he was a kid when nobody knew who he was. So those are the traits that I would like you to think about. Develop self-interest. Get gritty, get tough. Don't let setbacks delay you. Use big picture thinking to help you use that grit. Don't let the emotions get you. Be logical. And then finally, love the game. If you follow those traits, I think you will be on your way to success no matter what level. And so teach your students these traits and don't let them get distracted. Thanks very much, and I appreciate you coming to visit the joy of tennis teaching.